When a liberal professor tries to publicly humiliate a student she dislikes, she has no idea she's about to challenge a genius, and not just any genius, but a certified 170 IQ prodigy, Barron Trump. Trust me, by the end of this story, your jaw will be on the floor. But before I dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. At one of America's most prestigious universities, Dr. Linda Markham's advanced calculus class was infamous for two things: her undeniable mathematical brilliance and her increasingly blatant political agenda. That morning, as students filed into the lecture hall, an unusual tension hung in the air. Instead of the usual complex equations, the whiteboard displayed a bold message: today's topic, redefining academic priorities. In the back of the room sat a tall, quiet young man in a perfectly pressed black suit. Few of his classmates knew him personally, he preferred to keep to himself, but everyone knew his name, Barron Trump. What they didn't know was that beneath his reserved demeanor lay a mathematical mind that was about to leave the entire room speechless. Dr. Markham started her lecture, but something was off. Her usual confident stride had an almost aggressive edge as she paced before the class. Mathematics, she declared, while important, must make room for more pressing social discussions. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she continued outlining her so-called balanced curriculum. What happened next? You won't believe it. Barron's hand slowly rose into the air, a silent yet powerful challenge. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected anyone to question her authority today. What started as a discussion on curriculum changes quickly morphed into something far more revealing. In today's world, she continued, her tone laced with condescension, we must shift our focus from abstract theories to real-world applications of social justice. The air in the room grew heavier as she pulled up a PowerPoint slide, not on calculus, as expected, but on gender representation in STEM fields. Some of you, she added, her gaze drifting meaningfully toward certain students, may need to accept that your privileged position in this class doesn't necessarily reflect merit. Barron's hand remained raised, steady, patient, unshaken. Other students stole glances at him, then at each other. A few nodded subtly, silently relieved that someone was willing to challenge her. But Dr. Markham wasn't finished. Ignoring him, she clicked to the next slide. For instance, she continued, her voice now more pointed, family connections and wealth can create artificial advantages in education. The implication was crystal clear. Some students turned to gauge Barron's reaction, but his expression was unreadable, calm, composed, unwavering. His hand remained in the air. The tension in the room was palpable, stretching out until finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Markham could no longer ignore him. With a forced smile and a tone dripping with irritation and amusement, she sighed, "Yes, Mr. Trump? Do you have something to contribute to our discussion on privilege and education?" The room fell into complete silence. Everyone knew about Barron's flawless test scores and his quiet dedication to his studies. They had seen him in the library late at night, patiently helping struggling classmates. But now, as he slowly lowered his hand and began to speak, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. His voice was calm, respectful, and unwavering. Dr. Markham, I believe calculus is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this advanced class specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge. He paused for a moment before continuing, wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, several students nodding. But Dr. Markham's expression darkened. Mr. Trump, she said, emphasizing his last name, perhaps you, of all people, could benefit most from understanding how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone had private tutors in elite prep schools. What happened next stunned everyone. Instead of reacting defensively, Barron smiled, calm, composed, and unshaken. You're right about one thing, Professor. I have been fortunate in my education. And that's exactly why I believe we have a responsibility to uphold high academic standards, so everyone, no matter their background, can reach their full potential. A flush of frustration crossed Dr. Markham's face. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she shot back, "And you think you know better than your professor about maintaining academic standards? Tell me, what makes you such an expert on mathematical education?" Barron remained unfazed. "I'm not claiming to be an expert," he replied smoothly. "I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political divisions." The tension in the room was electric. He gestured toward the equation-free whiteboard. "Instead of debating privilege, couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of calculus?" The class held its breath as Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed dangerously. Slowly, she walked to the board, marker in hand. "Very well, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice laced with challenge. "Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test." Her hand moved swiftly, crafting an equation so complex that several students gasped. It was an advanced multivariable integration problem, the kind that even graduate students would struggle with. Stomachs sank across the room as Dr. Markham turned back to Barron, smirking. "Since you're so concerned about maintaining academic standards, why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd rather discuss your privileged background instead." The challenge was clear, a blatant attempt at public humiliation, and some students shifted uncomfortably. One even muttered, "That's graduate-level stuff." But Barron's expression didn't change. His composure was steady, his confidence unwavering. "Of course," he said quietly, standing up. "I'd be happy to try." And with that, he strode toward the front of the room, ready to take on the impossible. Dr. Markham's smirk widened. She had chosen this problem precisely because it required techniques far beyond what she had taught, concepts well outside the scope of their coursework. But as Barron took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine curiosity instead of the hesitation she had expected, her confidence wavered ever so slightly. A few students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. "Before I begin," Barron said, turning to face the class, "I noticed this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method, or would you be interested in a more efficient solution I learned while studying Leibniz's original papers?" The room tensed as Dr. Markham's expression faltered. The casual reference to Leibniz's work caught her off guard. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked, unable to mask her surprise. "Yes," Barron replied simply. "In German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology." Without waiting for a response, he turned back to the board, marker poised. "But perhaps we should let the mathematics speak for itself." A deep, uneasy silence filled the room. What had started as a public challenge had taken an unexpected turn, and as Barron began writing the first line of his solution, not even Dr. Markham could predict what was about to unfold. Students watched in stunned silence as his hand moved across the board with practiced precision, each step clear, deliberate, and surprisingly elegant. But what truly held their attention wasn't just how effortlessly he solved the problem, it was his running commentary. "This first step," he explained calmly, "uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. His marker continued gliding over the whiteboard, transforming what had seemed impossibly complex into something almost effortless. Dr. Markham's confident expression began to waver as she followed Barron's work. Between steps, he paused briefly, ensuring the entire class could follow his logic. This wasn't just about solving the problem, he was teaching it. Several students had pulled out their phones, recording his explanation, and even those who usually struggled with calculus found themselves grasping concepts they had never fully understood before. "Now," he said, reaching a crucial point in the solution, "we have two paths forward." He turned to Dr. Markham. "The traditional method would take another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer to see, Professor?" The room held its breath as Dr. Markham stood frozen, her earlier smugness completely gone. This wasn't just a question of mathematical preference, it was a quiet yet undeniable reminder of the depth of knowledge she had tried to dismiss. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, something unexpected happened. A hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could we see both? Asked Sarah Chen, one of the quieter students. This is actually helping me understand last week's chapter better. A warm smile crossed Barron's face as he nodded at Sarah, then turned to Dr. Markham, waiting for her response. But this moment was about more than just a math problem. It was about whether the professor could recognize when a true teaching moment transcended her personal biases. Just as she was about to answer, the classroom door burst open. Dean Richardson, a known ally of Dr. Markham's political activism, strode in. Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes. The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Markham, or better, as she thought. Seizing the opportunity, she straightened up. We'll have to continue this demonstration another time, she said, trying to regain control of the situation. But before she could step away, Barron spoke up, his voice calm yet firm. Professor, you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone. The room fell silent once more. His voice carried a quiet authority that made even the dean pause. Walking away now would send a dangerous message about academic integrity. The class erupted in murmurs, and the dean's face reddened. Young man, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, sir, Barron interrupted politely but firmly. I'm stating a fact. Dr. Markham issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accepted. The only question is, will she honor her own challenge? The tension in the room was electric. Several students had their phones out, recording what was quickly becoming an unforgettable moment. Dr. Markham looked trapped, caught between her powerful ally and the consequences of her own actions, while the dean hesitated, unsure whether to assert his authority or retreat. Then, Barron did something no one expected. He handed the marker back to Dr. Markham. Or perhaps, he said with a slight smile, you'd prefer to show us your solution first. After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections shouldn't matter, only knowledge should. And surely, as our professor, you can solve the problem you presented. A deafening silence filled the room. Dr. Markham stared at the marker in her hand, her expression shifting as she realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. The dean's presence, which she had seen as an escape, now felt like another witness to her predicament. The atmosphere in the classroom was thick with tension as she gripped the marker, her knuckles turning white. The dean shifted uncomfortably, sensing this was no longer a simple classroom debate, it was something much bigger. Students held their breath, phones still recording, knowing they were watching a defining moment unfold. Dr. Markham started, then stopped, her hand trembling slightly as she looked at the complex equation she had written. The same equation she had chosen to humiliate a student was now a blade hanging over her own credibility. Barron, ever composed, offered graciously, perhaps we could solve it together. Sometimes, collaboration leads to better understanding. His tone held no mockery, no arrogance, only a genuine offer to turn this confrontation into a learning experience. But Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't let her accept the olive branch. This is ridiculous. Dr. Markham snapped, throwing the marker down. This entire display is just a privileged student trying to undermine my authority. The dean, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. Let's all take a step back. No, Barron said firmly, picking up the marker. Let's take a step forward. He turned to the board and, in a breathtaking display of mathematical mastery, solved both solutions, the traditional method and Liv's approach, in under 5 minutes. As he wrote the final line, the classroom erupted in spontaneous applause, and even the dean couldn't hide his amazement. But what happened next would shake the entire department. Dr. Markham's face had gone from red to pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling before her eyes. But Barron wasn't finished. His next words would prove that true leadership isn't about winning arguments, but building bridges. He turned to Dr. Markham and the dean. The beauty of mathematics, he said, is that it doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases, it only cares about truth. He gestured toward the board. These equations don't just teach calculus, they teach us about learning itself. When we let our preconceptions cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow. The dean cleared his throat. Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that what? A voice called from the back. It was Michael Chen, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. That we should learn less math because of someone's political agenda? More students stood up. I came here to learn calculus, another called out, not to be lectured about my supposed privilege. Dr. Markham's control of the classroom was unraveling, but before she could face complete humiliation, Barron did something remarkable. Professor, he said, loud enough to quiet the growing dissent, your mathematical knowledge is extensive. I've learned a lot from your technical lectures. Perhaps we could focus on that? I'd be happy to assist students after class, combining your theoretical expertise with practical problem solving. The offer hung in the air, a chance for Dr. Markham to save face while actually improving the class. The dean watched intently, realizing this moment could either explode into a PR nightmare or become something transformative. Dr. Markham looked at Barron, then at her students, really looked at them. And what she saw in their faces forced her to make a decision that would change everything. Her voice was barely audible at first. She started, then straightened her shoulders. I've made a terrible mistake. The admission seemed to cost her, but something had shifted. For years, I was so focused on fighting perceived privilege that I became exactly what I claimed to oppose, someone who judges based on preconceptions rather than merit. She turned to Barron. You didn't just solve that equation, you taught me something about true leadership. The dean stepped forward, sensing an opportunity. Perhaps this could be a model for other departments, but before he could spin this into an administrative win, chaos erupted outside. A crowd had gathered in the hallway, students from other classes, drawn in by the viral videos being posted in real time. Some held up hastily made signs, teach math, not politics, and merit over bias. The situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control, but once again, Barron stepped up. Walking to the door, he addressed the crowd. If you're here because you want to learn, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, then come in, there's plenty of room. Students flooded inside, filling every available space. Dr. Markham watched in amazement as Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. Now, he said, who wants to learn about the real-world applications of calculus? What followed over the next hour would become university legend, not because of politics or conflict, but because of something far more powerful. Word of what happened in Dr. Markham's class spread like wildfire, but instead of becoming a tale of division and humiliation, it transformed into something inspiring. In the weeks that followed, attendance in the advanced calculus class tripled, not just because students wanted to learn math, but because they wanted to witness something remarkable. Dr. Markham, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion for mathematics, and Barron, true to his word, began hosting study sessions that bridged theoretical knowledge with practical application. But the most surprising change wasn't in the curriculum, it was in the culture. The class became a place where questions were welcomed, where merit truly mattered, and where learning transcended political divides. Students who once struggled now thrived. One day, as Barron was helping a student master a difficult concept, Dr. Markham approached him. You know, she said, you could have destroyed my career that day. Instead, you helped save it. She hesitated, then added, your father would be proud. Barron's response reflected a wisdom beyond his years. The goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor, he said. It was to lift everyone up. Today, that calculus class stands as a reminder that true education isn't about power struggles or politics, it's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to do so with grace. And Barron Trump? He still sits in the back of the class, still helps struggling students, and still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn, and to help others do the same. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments what you thought about this episode, and I'll see you in the next video.